"The chart isn't yours," I whispered, too low to pierce the glow of the lights. The CEO smiled at the audience as if my phrase were air conditioning. The projector hummed and splashed blue numbers across the glass walls, while the smell of burnt coffee mixed with the metallic perfume of the cables. The city, out there, blinked as if agreeing with the lie that swallowed us whole. "Ladies and gentlemen, the margin projection came from my executive team," he said, and the word "my" burst inside like an overheated bulb. The audience took notes in religious silence, water glasses forming perfect circles of condensation. He repeated my phrases, even the calculated pause after the outlier, and the applause seemed louder under the low ceiling. My pulse matched the projector's hum, and on the monitor the curve looked colder than I remembered. "You look pale," said a voice to my right, attentive eyes, skeptical, and a silver badge reflecting light on my chin. The name I'd read later. "Breathe," she finished, almost without moving her lips. The CEO thanked them, promised to historic quarters, while the chairs scraped the floor and the hallway swallowed the audience. In the hallway, the air smelled of heated printer. He saw me and raised his hand in performative fashion. "Tomorrow we align the narrative," he said, like someone asking for more ice in their glass, and my stomach responded before my voice. That's what they call it when they kill the truth. In the polished steel elevator, a calculating face stared back at me from the mirrored ceiling. On the 40th floor, I promised not to forget the taste of that floor. On my floor, late lights, 2 wet mugs, a crooked napkin. I wrote, "I'll prove it tomorrow," opened my notebook and reworked queries until I found a number out of place, a thread that entered through a secondary report and exited through a forbidden account. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, and before dawn, the wail of an ambulance separated the before from the after. Then I read the badge, Sarah Mitchell. In the reflection, I returned my name to the face. I'm 42 years old. I'm Michael Carter. I arrived so early that the coffee still had no taste, and the lights took time to recognize my presence. I sat, called the system by its nickname, and the logs responded with the coldness of those who never sleep. The detail that didn't fit the chart guided me. 3 decimal points where there had always been 2. A fractional transfer camouflaged in exchange adjustments. Whoever does that doesn't trust chance. They trust habit, and there the habit was to believe everything that's shown. I went back 2 months. The same microscopic deviation, patient, almost polite. Sister spreadsheets repeated a too human error to be an error. I assembled the torn photograph piece by piece. The morning sliced shadows like a blade when the printer spat out 2 sheets that I grabbed like a summons. "You again before 8, said Sarah as she appeared, neutral tone of a well-written contract. I showed her line by line. "Value segregation pattern," she murmured, and when I asked if it was systemic, she replied, "Then the house is bigger than it seems." We sat side by side, originals, stamps, hashes, dates saying what speeches hide, all arrows pointing to the same place. "Do you want to follow through with this?" she asked. "Want to? No, I need to," I replied, feeling a year older in my shoulders. "If there's interference, I'll trigger access blackout," she said. "Maybe it's the only chance for the truth to breathe," I retorted. She drew in the air. 3 days, 72 hours without alarms. The count started in my chest, each beat a number without a cell. I noted steps, names, doors, stuck them on the monitor. Without backing, all shine is dead. At lunch, the CEO crossed the hallway, light hand on my shoulder. "Great work yesterday," I replied with a sure that didn't agree, and in the glass reflection, I saved the date. Today it begins. Sarah returned with a mental calendar and said time was against us, as if every minute were a comma that could condemn an entire sentence. I nodded and created an encrypted mirror of the server, so nothing would die in the cold light of the data center. The building breathed in mechanical cycles, and people seemed to obey them without noticing, like tides of badges and caffeine. I froze screenshots and saved IP logs while the city out there pretended normality in its traffic lights. 3 days sounded short, but sometimes the truth is quick when it doesn't need permission. In the middle of the afternoon, I found a series of emergency authorizations signed at times that didn't match the CEO's official schedule. The signatures were too perfect, like stamps polished to fool tired eyes, and the descriptions used jargon that hid guilty simplicities. Sarah read the lines in silence and marked two in red, asking for depth in the approval history. I traced the origin to a user with privileges that should only exist in contingencies. The accounting trail repeated the patience of someone hiding an ocean with stacked cups. If you've ever survived meetings where your voice didn't fit at the table, you know why I keep telling this story without jumps. Here's the invitation to follow each piece that fits, because here the numbers breathe and memory doesn't bend to easy applause. If you want to be around when the last mask falls, subscribe and come with me to the end of this investigation. I promise to deliver what I demanded of myself: precision, courage, and silence only when it's proof. And if I hesitate, let it be only to ensure the truth is properly signed. On Thursday morning, the elevator stopped on the board floor as if sensing a storm, and the hallway seemed like an archive of contained steps. Richard Hale crossed past me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, asking if I had performance updates. I gave him an irrelevant summary, the kind of response that feeds the ego without killing the hunger. When you work close to power, you learn to measure words like someone measuring gunpowder, and at that hour, gunpowder was all I had in abundance. In the data lab, I recalculated reconciliations and compared metadata, taking each file to a dark room where digital signatures lost their makeup. 3 documents showed the same editing pattern: changes made in the dead of night by an escalated account and reverted before business hours. That required someone with access and fear, a combination that leaves deep footprints even when the shoes are expensive. Sarah suggested a parallel check on the corporate email provider, and I aligned the request with terms that wouldn't set off sirens. The goal was simple: see without being seen, confirm without warning. Near the end of the day, I traced a ghost transfer that used a non-existent project code, the secret door behind the rug. It fragmented into micropayments, traveling through 3 banks and returning as hedge adjustment, the kind of mask that convinces those who want to be convinced. That's when I felt the story stuck in my throat, heavy and inevitable, like an ad before the disaster. I breathed, aligned the statements, and gave a name to what I saw: systemic diversion with continued intent. And before the night decided for me, I confirmed the old commitment: tomorrow I speak, and the numbers will speak with me. Friday began with a harder cold than usual, the kind of cold that seems to seep through the glass walls. The floor lights came on one by one, and each flash seemed to reveal something that should remain hidden. Sarah arrived without saying anything, bringing 2 physical folders, a rarity in a world that believes paper doesn't lie. Inside them, receipts, authorizations, and signatures that never passed audit, a choreography of discreet deceptions. I looked at her and understood without words. The truth was already closer than the courage to face it. We began crossing the documents with the digital data, and the symmetry of the frauds was almost poetic. Each diversion had the same time interval, the same approval code, and the same signature. It wasn't just an error, it was a plan repeated with military precision. Sarah sighed, ran her hair through her head, and said, "This is big, Michael. Too big for the 2 of us." I replied that big are the silences that come after omission. And in that moment, I realized she had chosen the same side as me, the side that only sleeps when the truth breathes. By late morning, a system alert indicated external access to the reports we had isolated. Someone knew. The room felt small. The air conditioner's sound turned into an almost painful hum. Sarah closed her notebook and said only, 72 hours. He'll protect himself, and fast. I watched the digital clock on the wall, time marking not just seconds, but the start of the collapse. Everything that had been stable now trembled, and the glass, which always seemed solid, began to show the first cracks. That night, Richard Hale organized a corporate dinner at an expensive restaurant with a panoramic city view. The mood was celebratory, as if nothing was out of place. I sat near the window,
where I could see my own reflection over the lit horizon, a man divided between fear and the need for justice. Hale toasted, raised his glass, and spoke about transparency and meritocracy, words that slid down the glass like cheap wine. I only thought about how the sound of cutlery seemed like a countdown disguised as applause. Sarah, seated a few places away, looked at me with the serenity of someone who understands the danger but has already accepted the price. I received an encrypted message on my phone. 48 hours. The audit has been notified. I felt the air thin, and every laugh around seemed like an echo out of time. Hale talked about results and growth, and I saw numbers hovering over every face, numbers that didn't lie. For a moment I thought of confronting him there, in front of everyone, but hasty revenge is the cousin of imprudence. The truth still needed to ripen in the dark. When the dinner ended, Hale shook my hand too hard and with too little smile. "Michael, we need to talk about that spreadsheet on Monday," he said with the same paternal tone he used to hide threats. I returned an almost invisible smile and replied, "Of course, sir. Monday will be a great day to talk about numbers." He didn't catch the double meaning, or pretended not to. I left there with the metallic taste of anticipation and the certainty that before the sun rose twice, the glass empire he had built would shatter.
Sunday began without haste, but the corporate world doesn't respect calendars. At 7 in the morning, my phone vibrated like an omen. Sarah had detected unusual movements in the main database. Someone was trying to erase traces. I turned on the notebook, the room still half dark, and the screen light reflected in my eyes like a confession. The IP came from Hale's penthouse, the remote access made by an account only he could use. With every file deleted, a new one was silently saved in the parallel cloud I had created. The truth copied itself while he tried to kill it. I spent the whole day rewriting logs, storing redundancies, shielding every document with double authentication. The air inside the apartment grew heavy, full of the hum of fans and the nervous click of the keyboard. Outside, New York moved as if nothing was about to explode. I thought about how lies have a dangerous beauty. The more perfect, the louder the noise when they collapse. Sarah called me in the late afternoon, voice tense, and warned that the board would be informed at dawn. "Get ready," she said. "The war will start before coffee." That night, I sat on the balcony and watched the lights reflected in the buildings like windows of liquid glass. I thought about everything I would lose if the plan went wrong. Reputation, job, even peace itself. But I also thought about what I would gain. The right to sleep without fearing the mirror. The cold wind reminded me that time was running out and that there is no redemption without sacrifice. When I finally closed the laptop, I noticed the clock marked 11:59 p.m., the last minute of calm before the collapse. And deep down, I could already hear the crack of the glass breaking. On Monday, Empire Tech dawned different. The hallways, once crowded with empty greetings, now whispered like confessionals. Sarah crossed paths with me in the lobby, not hiding the tension. "They received the dossier," she murmured, and her voice sounded like the start of a sentence. We went up together to the board's meeting room, the heart of the empire Hale had built on layers of ego and false numbers. Inside, the CEO was already waiting. Rehearsed smile, impeccable suit, restless hands. When he looked at me, I understood that he knew, and yet he pretended not to. The presentation began with the usual liturgy, charts, goals, promises, until Helena Price, head of internal audit, entered the room and placed a USB drive on the table. "Before we proceed, there's an inconsistency in the financial reports," she said with a neutral and deadly voice. The tension cut the air like electricity. Hale tried to keep control, making forced jokes, but every chart projected on the screen was an accusation. The spreadsheets displayed digital signatures that linked him directly to $33 million diverted.
and for the first time, his smile failed. As the silence stretched, I realized the real weight of the truth. It doesn't shout. It just occupies space until it suffocates the lie. Sarah gave me a quick glance, and I just nodded discreetly, signaling that everything was as planned. Hale tried to blame subordinates, but every justification stumbled over its own data. The room, once complicit, now watched him like a stranger. When Helena ended the presentation, the board suspended Hale and called in the federal police. We left without celebrations, just the muffled sound of doors closing. 3 days, I thought. 3 days for an empire to fall. The next morning, the local news opened with the headline, "Billion-dollar corporate fraud rocks Empire Tech." The cameras showed the building I knew better than my own home, now surrounded by squad cars and reporters. I watched from afar, from my apartment window, sipping coffee that cooled too fast. Sarah sent me a short message. He's been arrested. No celebration, just the dry relief of someone who survived the fire. And in the silence that followed, I realized the weight of what we had done. Not an act of heroism, but of necessity.
The mood was like a discreet funeral, and faces avoided eye contact, as if everyone feared being next to fall. The interim director thanked my cooperation and said the full audit would take weeks. "You did the right thing, Michael," she commented. I wanted to believe it, but the right thing sometimes costs dearly. When I entered the room where it all began, the smell of clean glass and silence returned memories I didn't ask for. Hale's chair was still there, empty, but alive, as if watching. At night, I walked the city trying to understand the emptiness that comes after the truth. Manhattan's streets had the same rhythm, but something in me moved in another time. I thought it would feel satisfaction, maybe revenge, but what I felt was tiredness. A deep, clean tiredness, like the end of a long fever. The lie had been unmasked, but its scars would linger for some time. In a strange way, I missed the illusion. It was comfortable. The truth isn't. The truth is too sharp to fit in the pockets of someone who still needs to work tomorrow. 3 days later, the board called an emergency meeting. The mood was tense. The air conditioning seemed to whisper secrets. One of the counselors asked if there was information about who had delivered the evidence to the audit. Helena Price kept her neutral tone, but her eyes quickly sought me out, a silent acknowledgement. "The author of the original reports still prefers anonymity," she replied. The phrase protected me more than any contract. When the meeting ended, Sarah waited for me in the hallway, holding 2 coffees and a look that mixed relief and complicity. "You're terrible at staying anonymous," she joked. We went down together to the exit, crossing the atrium that now seemed different. Employees whispered, reporters prowled the lobby, and the Empire Tech brand began to reinvent itself by force. Sarah told me the FBI had confirmed the authenticity of all files, and Hale's process would be quick. The evidence was irrefutable. "You know this changes everything, right?" she said. "Inside here, no one will look at you the same way." I smiled faintly. "Maybe it's time to stop being invisible," I replied. But inside, I knew, too much visibility also attracts storms. When I got home, I found an envelope without a sender at the door. Inside, just a typed sheet with a single phrase: "The truth only stays alive when someone keeps looking." No signature, no seal. Just the distant sound of the city and the echo of what might still be hidden. I closed the curtains and looked at the reflection in the glass. The same glass that had accompanied me from the beginning. It wasn't the same man there anymore, and maybe that was the highest price of the truth. Justice, after all, never comes free. The following weeks were a blur of meetings, reports, and testimonies. Empire Tech tried to erase its own trail,
while the press dug up new scandals with the hunger of those who never sleep. My name began to circulate among journalists, still wrapped in assumptions. Sarah called me every morning to make sure I was okay, and I said yes, but the yes no longer meant the same. Sleeping became an exercise in survival. Sometimes I woke up with the feeling of still being trapped in that glass room, with lights reflecting lies on the right faces. The world went on, but I was still stopped at the moment when the sound of applause turned into a denunciation. On a Friday night, I received an email from the new interim CEO inviting me to join the company's ethical restructuring team. It was ironic, but also fair. I spent the weekend reading the document, trying to decide if I accepted. Sarah said I deserved to close the cycle, to see the change happen from within. I didn't know if I still believed in inside and outside. Everything seemed contaminated. On Sunday, I walked to the pier, the salty wind mixing with the smell of rust and sea. I thought about how the truth, when exposed, doesn't clean, it just illuminates. And not everyone likes what they see in the light. I accepted the position on Monday. I entered the building under curious gazes, feeling that air owed me something. In the new office, I found a temporary plaque with my name, simple, in black letters. I touched the cold metal and realized how much the path to there had cost me. Revenge had turned into responsibility, and responsibility is the kind of weight that doesn't let go. Sarah appeared at the door with 2 coffees and said, "Welcome back, Chief of Truth." I smiled. It wasn't what I wanted to be, but maybe it was what the moment asked for. 2 months later, Empire Tech began to breathe with less guilt. Transparency meetings, ethics training, new protocols, all impeccably designed to rebuild lost trust. But trust, I learned, doesn't rebuild, it scars. Sarah worked by my side, and sometimes, when the office silence was too heavy, we exchanged glances that remembered what no one else knew. The Hale case had become an academic study, old headline, and for some, corporate legend. For me, it was just fresh memory. The wound still throbbed, even covered by reports and compliance stamps. On a rainy afternoon, reviewing old audits, I found something that shouldn't exist. A transaction deleted months before the scandal. It was small, insignificant at first glance, but the record format made me freeze. It was the same structure as the previous frauds, but signed by another account. I analyzed the lines, and the déjà vu feeling locked my wrist. I didn't want to believe it, but there it was. The same pattern, the same patience in the numbers. I breathed deeply, closed my eyes, and counted to 5. The truth, apparently, hadn't ended. It had just changed to dresses. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain ran down the glass like indecipherable code, and the city lights flickered outside, reflecting 1,000 versions of myself. I thought of calling Sarah, but hesitated. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was instinct warning me that the cycle was restarting. The wall clock struck exactly 7, and in that moment, I realized something. The corporate world never purifies completely. It just reorganizes, more discreet, more intelligent. I pressed my forehead against the glass and let the cold remind me. The truth doesn't end, it repeats in silence. In the days that followed, I tried to ignore the unease, pretend that strange number was just an isolated error, but those who have lived fraud up close learned to recognize its smell. And it was back, disguised as routine. I requested access to old records, justifying with a compliance audit, and dove into the fiscal code lines. With every report opened, the suspicion grew. The dates matched the new directorate's transition period, and the amount, though small, was replicated in different accounts, as if someone was testing the limits of the new system. It was the same DNA of corruption, just subtler, more confident. I summoned Sarah to review the findings. When she entered the room,
I noticed her tired gaze reflected the same weight I carried. I showed her the spreadsheets, the records, and the familiar trace of automated authorizations. "This isn't coincidence, Michael," she said, voice tense. "Someone learned from Hale and is starting over." The silence between us was denser than any data. What hurt most wasn't the crime itself, but the realization that the company swearing redemption was already being infiltrated again. The wounds had closed, but the virus was still in the blood. At the end of the day, Sarah asked me to wait before acting. "If we move too soon, they'll hide better," she explained. I agreed, but inside me the urgency burned. I left the building and walked in the rain, without an umbrella, trying to cool my head. The streets shone like broken mirrors, and every reflection reminded me of the price of being the one who sees what others prefer to ignore. Sometimes the truth tires. Sometimes it looks back at you. And that night, as the cold wind pushed me down Madison Avenue, I realized the cycle had restarted, and I would be once again its prisoner.
It was the interim CFO, Daniel Cross, young, charismatic, and ambitious. The kind of executive the market calls promising, but time calls dangerous. His transactions seemed impeccable, but hid microscopic diversions that, added up, formed millions. Sarah wanted to take him straight to the board, but I held back. "Without complete proof, he'll turn victim and we'll be the guilty ones," I explained. She looked at me with the calm anger of someone who has already lost faith in processes. "Then collect the proof, Michael. But remember what happened last time." And I remembered very well. That night, I reviewed every document, every access, and realized I was retracing the same path from 2 years ago. The folders, the logs, the isolation, everything the same. Except this time, I didn't feel courage, I felt exhaustion. Still, something kept me there. The certainty that silence is the preferred fertilizer for lies. When I finally closed the notebook, I saw a notification pop up on the screen. It was an anonymous email, addressed to me with the single line, "You shouldn't have messed with this, Michael." The air seemed to vanish from the room, and for the first time in a long time, I felt real fear. The night of that email was long, the kind of night where time drags with its own intentions. The monitor stayed on, projecting my tired face onto the window glass. Outside, New York breathed without hurry, indifferent to the threats lurking in my inbox. I read the message again, each word cold as metal. The anonymity had the same smell as corporate cowardice, expensive, calculated, impersonal. It wasn't a warning, it was a reminder that the game hadn't ended. I opened the message source code and traced the IP. Internal. The ghost was inside the house. The next day, I entered the building with the badge weighing like a sentence. Sarah waited for me in the elevator, and one look was enough for her to understand something had changed. I showed her the message, and she stayed silent for long seconds before saying, "They know you're too close." She was right. Daniel Cross had already moved his pawns. That morning, he announced new security policies, all conveniently aimed at reviewing administrative accesses. I was one of them. The walls began to close in, and paranoia installed itself like a virus. I had lived this before, but now I wasn't the same man. In the afternoon, I made a decision. I printed the complete dossier, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it directly to Helena Price, now Global Audit Vice President. No digital traces, no messages, no trails. It was my last card before disappearing from the board. I left the building before sunset, walked to Bryant Park, and sat in silence, watching the light's reflection dance on the fountain's surface. I thought of Hale, Sarah, the company, and everything that would remain when the new truth came to light. Justice, I realized, is an unstable flame, and whoever carries it inevitably gets burned. I looked at the water mirror,
saw my reflection trembling, and whispered to myself, "Some mirrors never break. They just wait for the next look."